It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the ViewSonic XG270QC. The OSD is controlled by a little joystick in the central region beneath the Elite logo. There's also a power button and also a quick access button, which I'll go through when I go through that in the main menu system. And there is a power LED, so a small rectangle that glows blue when the monitor's on, or amber when the monitor enters a low power state, so signal to the system is lost. You can disable that LED when the monitor's on if you prefer in the OSD. If you twiddle the joystick left, up or down, it just goes to the main menu system. If you press it down, it goes into the main menu system. If you twiddle it right, it allows you to quickly change the input used by the monitor, so you can select the HDMI port 1, HDMI port 2 or display port. So the main menu system, the first section is game mode, so that's your presets, your main presets of the monitor. Oh, and by the way, if you see any little dancing lines on the screen, that's just more away from the camera, it's not actually on the monitor itself, so don't worry about that. The first one's standard, the second and third, they're actually custom 1 and custom 2. I've actually renamed them because you can do that, and I'll show you how to do that shortly, but I've called one of them test, custom 1's test, Custom 2 LBL. I've actually set these up in exactly the same way. Test is my test settings, and you can find that in the written review, whereas LBL has a low blue light function attached to it as well. So it's very easy to use the quick access, which I'll show you shortly, to switch between these two. But essentially standard Custom 1 and Custom 2, or what I've called test and LBL, they're fully customizable, so you can change everything in the OSD, and you can have 3 different sets of settings. One for standard, one for custom 1, one for custom 2. You can't change absolutely everything. Not everything is assigned. Some things are assigned universally, so they'll apply to all of the presets. But most of the key settings will only apply to custom 1, custom 2, or standard if you're adjusting them when you've got that preset selected. There's also FPS, and this really just upsets the image balance. It makes things overly bright, overly sharp, various other things, and it locks off some of your controls. So you'll see here in display, color temperatures grayed out, so you can't adjust the red, green and blue color channels or set the color temperature to something else other than what it's using for FPS mode, which has quite a cool tint, at least it does on my unit. And if you go to color adjust, you can see that gamma's grayed out, color saturation, black stabilization. So it has these set to various different things, and you can't adjust them manually. You can adjust the brightness, as you can see, but you can't adjust the sharpness. And this monitor actually has sharpness which is too high by default. At least certainly according to my eye it did. So I'd really need to reduce that, and you can't with this setting. Similar story with MOBA, but it makes various other adjustments. Battle Royale. This makes things look really quite weird. It kind of oversaturates certain shades, makes the gamma very funky. So I don't know, perhaps there is some kind of competitive reason for this. Maybe it makes characters easier to spot whilst they're parachuting through the sky. I don't really have a lot of experience with that kind of game. Next is realistic, and this is intended to give quite a neutral look to the image. It's actually quite similar to the standard preset, but again, it locks various things off. So you can't access the color temperature, and the same, you can't access gamma, various other things like that, or the sharpness. There's console speed, so these are really console oriented, but they're just presets. They don't do anything special. None of these presets, by the way, will improve input lag or responsiveness, although it does set the pixel overdrive, which is response time OD, to various different settings according to the preset, and you can always adjust that in every preset. I think in every preset. Now I've said that, I hope that's true. But I certainly think that's the case. So console speed, kind of over-sharpened. Gamma, a little bit off, I think. Console color, this gives a richer look to the image. There appears to be some oversaturation, but it's very bright, overly sharp. So it just makes various other adjustments. And again, as I'm sure you can guess, it locks off various settings. So I would just stick to using standard, custom 1 and custom 2. Custom 1 and 2 are particularly useful. As I've said, you can rename them, and you can have different sets of settings for each one. Next is display. You can enable FreeSync Premium Pro, and this enables adaptive sync, in other words, on the monitor. So if you've got a compatible AMD GPU, you could use AMD FreeSync Premium Pro, or AMD FreeSync. Premium Pro, if you're not aware, that just means that there's a certain variable refresh rate range supported. It supports HDR at the same time, but HDR on this monitor isn't AMD specific or tied to FreeSync. It's just a marketing term, but FreeSync Premium Pro, it is supported on this model. And you'll see that various things are grayed out now. HDR, and that's only because HDR you can either set to auto or off. It's set to auto by default, and that means when an HDR signal is detected, it will switch to the HDR mode. With FreeSync Premium Pro, you just can't disable HDR in the monitor, but if you've just got an SDR signal, then it's not going to be using HDR anyway, so generally you don't have to worry about that. Pure XP is grayed out because that's a strobe backlight setting that causes the monitor to flicker at a frequency matching the refresh rate of the display, and I'll show you that shortly. Overclocking, that's grayed out as well. It doesn't really do an awful lot. I'll also come on to that shortly. Hertz limiter, grayed out, but everything else is accessible. So as I said, HDR you can set to auto or off normally when you don't have FreeSync Premium Pro active in the monitor, so you don't have Adaptive Sync active. Pure XP, so that's the strobe backlight setting, and I do have to give you a flicker warning here because you might notice some flickering in the video when I activate this. It has various different settings. Light is the brightest setting. You can definitely see that flicker, and I can certainly see it on my camera's preview screen. So it's now flickering at 165 Hz. You can also use this at 144 Hz and 120 Hz. The light setting is the brightest, and as you increase this, it's dimmer. So this is your brightness control with the Pure XP setting. It's all explored in the review, in the written review. But Ultra gives you potentially the best motion clarity, but the lowest brightness. And actually, in my testing, I don't find a huge difference in motion clarity between these. It's mainly the brightness that you'll notice is different. There's certainly a bit of a difference between light and normal, but anywhere above normal is really quite similar in terms of motion clarity. Overclocking. This is a bit strange. What this does, it actually has two things. It will change the maximum refresh rate to 166 Hz, which is absolutely meaningless, but I guess they've just done that so they can actually call this feature overclocking. But the main thing it does is if you're using DisplayPort, and you will need to use DisplayPort for this to actually be usable. If you're using HDMI, this will be grayed out. You can't do this. It will also add a 4K downsampling mode. So 4K will be listed as a resolution. This is also supported by default over HDMI anyway, so it's just something that's added if you're using DisplayPort. There's Hertz limiter. Now what this doesn't do, it doesn't change the system refresh rate. It's really just a frame rate cap, or it acts as a frame rate cap. And as I showed you before, if you've got Adaptive Sync active, you can't use this feature. So really it would just be if you wanted to have things running at 165 Hz, for example, but you wanted the frame rate to stay at 100 frames a second maximum, you might do this. But you're also going to get lots of stuttering if you've got VSync enabled. It does have some utility, but I think in many cases users are just going to use a software cap for the frame limiter, or they're going to be using Adaptive Sync, and then this isn't actually usable. Response time OD. So they're the pixel overdrive settings, various different settings, even has a little explanation here. Not that that explanation is particularly useful, but it just changes the level of gray to gray acceleration. So standard's the slowest, then it gets progressively faster, all explored in the written review. It's blue light filter, and you can set this between 1 and 100, 100 being the strongest setting. And this is explored in the written review as well. So this is an effective low blue light setting. It gives a warmer look to the image. It slightly reduces the green color channel and also increases the red color channel. So it gives a better balanced look to the image than some settings of this nature on other models. And it's useful for relaxing evening viewing, as I like to call it. So in the hours leading up towards bedtime, when you should be minimizing blue light exposure, it's useful for that. Some people like to use it in the daytime as well, and that's fine. You can do that. I have it set to 5 here for reasons explained in the written review. There's then that color temperature setting, which I was talking about before. The top one there, sRGB, that's grayed out if you're using the blue light filter. That's all it is. So I'll just disable that. All sRGB does, it really just makes things dimmer. It sets the brightness to a lower level. It also grays out some options like contrast, gamma, black stabilization, so it really just gives you less flexibility, but it isn't an sRGB emulation setting. It doesn't do anything to the color gamut, so it's not really a particularly useful setting, to be honest. Bluish just makes the color temperature far too high, makes things look very cool, and not cool in a good way, cool as in a bluish way. Cool, which is slightly less extreme, but also makes the color temperature too high. Native, factory defaults. Warm, which is another low blue light setting, and this is actually just very similar to setting the blue light filter to 75. So it is very effective. Full color control allows you to change the red, green and blue color channels. Color adjust, you can change the color space between RGB and YUV, or leave it set to auto, which most people should just do. You can change the color range between auto, full range or limited range. Again, most people should just set it to auto, and it should match the system where possible. But if you need to enforce a limited range signal, perhaps you're using a certain games console which works better with limited range. I think the Nintendo Switch would be an example of that. I could be wrong and they might have changed that, but just going from memory, I think if you set that to auto, it should actually use a limited range signal, but if not, or if you need to enforce it, that's what you can do here. Gamma, you can set that between 1.8 and 2.8 in increments of 0.2, but the values posted here aren't necessarily going to be matched exactly, and you can see in the written review there is a bit of deviation on my unit, but not a massive deviation, so it's certainly the case that you can either have a lower or a higher gamma by changing this. Color saturation, so this is a digital saturation enhancement. What this will do is it will pull shades closer to the edge of the color gamut if you increase this beyond 50. What that does is it increases saturation levels for many shades, but it doesn't make the most saturated shades any more saturated because it's not adjusting the color gamut. So you crush things together, you lose shade variety. Some people just subjectively sometimes like increasing this, and that's fine if you do. Some people might even like to decrease this a bit, especially as this is a wide gamut monitor. So this can take a bit of an edge off the saturation with a slight adjustment here. But what I find is that actually some of the shades tend to look slightly oversaturated still, whilst others really have quite strong undersaturation. It's really very difficult to balance things by using this, but some people will just subjectively prefer it with a slight reduction here. I prefer to just leave this at 50. Black stabilization. Next you've got black stabilization. So this is a gamma enhancement feature, low end detail enhancement feature if you prefer. 11 is the default. If you increase this even slightly, it quite significantly ramps up the brightness of these darker shades. So I've got Lagom Black Levels test open here just to demonstrate this, and you can increase this all the way up to 22. It does work effectively, but it also has quite an effect on not just the darkest shades, but other shades as well. I don't know if you can see this in the video. It's probably just it looks a bit bleached in the video, but it seems to oversaturate things as well. So an ever increasing black stabilization level also increases saturation, but it isn't designed to make things look lovely. It's really just designed to give you a competitive edge, and it does do that, it does achieve that. Unlike some settings of this nature, it doesn't affect the black level, so that remains the same, so it doesn't affect the contrast. And if you decrease this, things look more cinematic, they're kind of crushed together, although it actually seems to, again, affect the gamma, and not in a good way, so it sort of makes things look a bit washed out, but also dull and dark if you decrease this, so a bit strange, but again, it's meant for competitive purposes. Next is image adjust, view scale. So these are really the scaling settings they apply when you're using a non-native resolution, so I'll just quickly switch over to the full HD resolution so I can show you what some of these do. So the monitor is now running full HD. It's using interpolation to display that. That's explored in the interpolation and upscaling section of the written review, by the way. So full uses all of the pixels of the monitor, has an interpolated full HD resolution in this case. Aspect will use as many pixels as it can whilst keeping to the aspect ratio. Of course, I selected full HD here, so it's 16:9, just like the monitor's aspect ratio, so no changes needed there. 1:1, this will just use the pixels called for in the source resolution. So it gives a completely undistorted full HD image there, so it's only using 1920 by 1080 pixels for the image, and the rest is a big black border. So that's the 1:1 pixel mapping feature. There are various other settings as well, kind of emulate different screen sizes and aspect ratios. You've got 19-inch 4:3. You can also use these when you're using the native resolution, so I'll just switch back to that quickly. Of course, you'll also see things are very squished up, and that's because I've got a 16:9 aspect ratio, and this is a scaling setting for 4:3. So if you're using an actual 4:3 aspect ratio for the resolution you've selected, it won't be crushed up like this, but it will simulate different screen size, so that's what it's supposed to be doing. 19-inch 16:10. And with this one, it also has a scale, so you can actually change how much of the screen it's filling. I'm not going to go through all of these, but if you set it to 100, it will just fill up all of the screen. So I'm not quite sure how that definitely maintains a 16:10 aspect ratio, if it seems to be changing that according to what you're doing there, but I think if it's set to 0, it is actually 16:10 and 19-inch, 21.5-inch 16:9. And again, it has that scale setting, so you can just slightly adjust it if you need to. 22-inch 16:10. And then there's 23.6-inch 16:9. Of course, it isn't squashed up because this is a 16:9 aspect ratio I'm using as well. And just to make things slightly bigger, 24-inch 16:9. Next, you can adjust the contrast, the brightness, sharpness. I like this set to 25. By default, it's set to 75, which is far too sharp. And as I showed you, with some of the presets, this is grayed out. If I didn't mention it before as well, view scale is only accessible if you're not using adaptive sync. Otherwise, it'll be grayed out. Advanced DCR, dynamic contrast ratio, that's explored in the written review. You can change this between 1 and 20 or 0, which is disabled. Increasing this actually just increases the sharpness level, so it doesn't change how dynamic the dynamic contrast setting is. It just makes things overly sharp and weird if you increase that too much. There's overscan, which is grayed out unless you're using a system where that's applicable or a signal where that's applicable. And in many cases it isn't. It's just for some older games consoles and that kind of thing. Next, there's input select. You'll never guess what that does. Don't think it needs an explanation. View mode. So these are some additional presets. Standard, movie, web, text, Mac and mono. And these make various different adjustments. So web is massively oversaturated. Movie just kind of looks bright and the gamma seems to be quite low, and I think it probably locks the gamma setting off as well. Yeah, so it just changes that to a low setting basically and then locks it off. Text. This just kind of looks overly sharp, but I think that's just because it's going to be using the default sharpness of 75. It also locks the gamma off. I know you can, I mean, it uses 50 for the sharpness, but you can adjust that if you want to. But really, these just make various adjustments. There's nothing that you can't achieve by making the adjustments yourself in the OSD, and then you get more flexibility. Mac, it's really quite similar to text, it appears. Maybe the gamma's a bit different. And mono, which is monochrome. Very cool. And again, you can actually achieve that by just reducing the saturation levels on the saturation slider to 0. And I'm guessing it doesn't let you adjust the saturation. Yeah, so very clever. It doesn't let you adjust the gamma or the color saturation, because if you were adjusting that saturation, which this is just setting to 0, you'd start getting your colors back. Next is Audio Adjust, which adjusts the volume of the integrated speakers or mutes them, or anything connected to the 3.5mm jack if you're using that. As I mentioned in the written review, the speakers are actually quite good on this monitor as far as integrated speakers go. Not too bad, they're quite usable. Setup menu, so language select. Next is information, so that tells you various things about the monitor, like the resolution. Quite useful here is V, the V frequency, the vertical frequency. So that will show you the refresh rate that it's running at. So there's a little bit of strange rounding or display going on there. So it says 165.3. Don't worry too much about the decimals there. But this will adjust according to the frame rate of the content if you've got adaptive sync active and you're within the variable refresh rate window. So it's a good way of telling if adaptive sync's actually working. Quick access. So this was that button I was talking about just at the start of the video, just next to the power button. So you can change what this shows. So I've got this set up at the moment. So it shows test and LBL because I like to quickly be able to switch between those. So it just lets you quickly cycle between 3 different things or up to 3 different things. I only have 2 here because that's all I use at the moment. You have it so you can quickly activate the blue light filter and that will put it straight up to 100. You can also have it so you can quickly activate pure XP or disable pure XP. And I think that will put it straight onto the highest mode for pure XP. I haven't actually tested this, but I'll just show you that now. Overclocking, FPS MOBA, so you can choose various different presets as well. And then you've got custom 1 and custom 2 at the end there, or in my case, test and LBL. So let's see what it does now. So when you press this just once, it only very briefly appears, but the point is it's supposed to cycle quickly between 3 different things. So I've got blue light filter, so that's fully on 100. When I press this again, it's going to flicker, by the way, so I have to give you a flicker warning because it's pure XP. And then you've got my test settings, or custom 1 as it'd be called by default. Just be aware, actually I should mention as well, with the blue light filter, if you activate this here with the quick menu, as I've just done now, and then I've switched back to my test settings, it will overwrite anything you had set to the blue light filter. So that's set to 0, although I actually had it set to 5 with my test settings. So just be aware that if you're using a lower setting than 100 for the blue light filter, it's going to overwrite that. Next is crosshair, so that allows you to change between 3 different styles of crosshair and 3 different colours for each style. So you've got type A, type B, type C, and green, white or yellow. And you can also adjust the position of the crosshair. Probably shouldn't have, I'll just change my wallpaper, I shouldn't have really selected white here, it's practically invisible. It's typical that, isn't it? Try again. There we are, a bit better. And you can adjust where it is shown on the screen by using the joystick if you don't want it to be central. Next there's Elite RGB, which I'll show you very shortly. Resolution notice, so that just gives you a message on the screen when you're running a non-native resolution, just to remind you that of what the native resolution is, and you should be using that for optimal performance. There's boot up screen, and that gives you a splash logo on the screen when you first turn the monitor on, and it'll take a little bit longer to start up, so that's why I've disabled that. But if you've got it enabled, I'll just show you what the boot screen looks like. So see, it says ViewSonic Elite AMD FreeSync Premium Pro. Takes a little bit longer to start up with this boot screen enabled. So I'll just turn it off and just show you how quickly it starts up with this set to off instead. So just press the button now. So I didn't time that. I'm not sure if it makes a massive difference, to be honest, but just it seems to be a little bit longer with the boot screen enabled. As you saw there, it wasn't exactly a super quick startup either way. It's OSD timeout, so that's how long after the last button press before the OSD will automatically disappear. Set that to 5, 15, 30 or 60 seconds. OSD background, so you can have this set to be a bit transparent if you prefer. Power indicator, so that's that little blue power LED. You can have that switched on or off. There's auto power off, so that will mean that if a signal is lost, the monitor will automatically switch off after a short amount of time. Quite a useful feature actually, I might as well just leave that on for myself. Sleep, and that will put the monitor onto standby after a given amount of time. Eco mode, this will just adjust the brightness. So optimize lowers it a bit from whatever you had set, and then conserve lowers it even more from whatever you had set. DDC/CI, part of the plug and play functionality, allows you to use software such as ViewSonic's Elite Display Controller software, which I'm going to show you shortly. DisplayPort 1.1, you just enable that for compatibility purposes if you're using an older system that doesn't work with DisplayPort 1.4 or newer versions like that. So this is set to off by default, which means it's actually using a newer version of DisplayPort, which will have the full HDR functionality and adaptive sync and all of that. But if you want to disable that functionality or you're using an older system, you can set that to 1.1. Standby charger, that allows you to use the USB ports to charge devices connected, even if the monitor is switched off with the power button. Rename, that's how you rename the preset. So I've got that set to test. It would have been custom 1 by default, this particular one. Then there's memory recall, which will set everything to the factory defaults, which I don't want to do. So back now to that RGB lighting feature, Elite RGB. You can set the base, so there are some little LEDs, there are 5 either side of that central Elite logo, facing downwards. That's the base. There's also the rear, so a little kind of accordion at the rear. So there's that on the left side and also the right side of the stand. So that's the rainbow effect. They're both doing a rainbow effect, which means they're cycling between various different shades. You can't see the rear ones from the front. They're actually very dim. You can only see them from the rear. So for most people, it's quite normal to have your monitor up against a wall. They don't do anything for you. There certainly isn't an aura or a glow around the monitor, so it can't be used as a bias light, this feature. I actually find the rainbow cycling effect with the base LEDs quite soothing, to be honest. I sometimes just have this set in the evenings. There's also breathing. So that just causes the LEDs to pulse, and the LEDs at the back are doing the same thing. Just gradually pulsing. And the stack, which does this kind of thing, little dancing effect. And at the rear, so you can have the rear and the base doing different things if you like. You can in fact just have them enabled individually if you prefer. So stack, it's, as you can see, they're really dim. I couldn't even locate them with the camera there. So there's the stack effect at the rear. Very subtle. You can also use the Elite Display Controller software and a few other software packages to control these RGB LEDs if you prefer. And to do that, you need the USB upstream cable connected. You can also reset them. So that will just set them to rainbow, which is the default for the rear and the base. Or you can switch them off if you prefer. I'm now going to show you the Elite Display Controller software. This is another method of controlling these RGB LEDs. So I'll just show you that functionality first. Something to be aware of with this software is that it will only launch if you have, and this caught me out for quite a while, I couldn't work out why it wasn't launching, but you need to have your sound source set to the monitor rather than your speakers or anything connected to your PC. So you need to have the monitor as the sound source, otherwise this won't open. I'm not sure exactly why that is. It seems to be a bit of an odd thing to do, but that's how it is. So you can see here various different things. You can change the preset used by the monitor quickly. If you press mode there, you can change a few different settings. It doesn't have every setting here, but there are various ones like the blue light filter, color temperature. Although if you select color temperature, you'll see that you can just cycle between the presets. So bluish, cool, native and warm, but you can't manually adjust the red, green and blue color channels, which seems a bit of an oversight, to be honest. And you'll see that Custom 1 and Custom 2 don't have the names that you might have assigned them to in the actual OSD. So it says Custom 1, but as you'll know, I've called that Test. Visual settings, so there are a few other settings. You can change the Pure XP setting, change the mode of that. HDR, either auto or off as usual. FreeSync Premium, you can enable that or disable that. So RGB, this is how you can customize these lights. And as I mentioned, you need the USB upstream cable connected, so you need to have it connected to the upstream of the monitor, and the downstream goes to your system. You can actually use the display controller software without the USB cable connected, but you can't activate the LEDs. They need to have the USB cable to control them. So you can choose any color here, and that will cause the LEDs to go static at this color. So I've got a nice red here, and at the rear as well. I know it appears a bit more orange on the video, but it is actually a fairly intense red. You get the idea, or you can have it set to white if you just want it to be a cool white color. And then there's rainbow, breathing and stack, as I showed you earlier. Warp speed is another one you can select here, which is just a fast flashing effect. And at the back, just for completeness, I'll show you what they're doing. Not a lot is the answer to that. See, very subtle, very dim, practically pointless. But hey, at least you've got those down-firing ones which you can actually see from the front. And there's music, which will just dance in time to music, or music pulse, which will dance in time to music with a slightly different effect. For copyright reasons, I don't really want to show you this, but... and just to be really boring... And in this video, I'm going to be taking a look at the that's me. So I can't have any copyright strikes against me for playing someone else's music or someone else's video. You get the idea. They're just pulsing.
Alongside information about how you can support the work that we do. So this model uses a 144 Hz IPS type panel.
That's the music setting. Or there's music pulse.
So it's not going to win any awards in terms of pixel density. That's not really what it's all about. But it is
so a slightly different flashing arrangement there. And the rear does the same thing.
Just to cover the external features quickly. So you've got a dual stage bezel design. So that means that there's a panel border around the image.
You can also use the RGB Alliance features. If you have a Razer Chroma peripheral, or you've got a Thermaltake peripheral which can use RGB+, then you can use Razer or Thermaltake's software to control the lights on the monitor alongside your peripheral. I don't have those peripherals, and it's not what I consider a core monitor feature anyway, so I'm not going to try and show you that. But if you do have Razer or Thermaltake equipment which is compatible with this, you can indeed control it by that method. So really the Elite Display Controller software, it doesn't really have as much functionality as some OSD control software does, but it's quite nicely laid out, quite simple to use. And that's really all there is to the OSD on-screen display menu system of the ViewSonic XG270QC. Be sure to check out the full review on PCmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.